just magically started working again tonight, so there's that. Tonight we're going to give our attention to 3 questions that have been submitted. And I would encourage you to please continue to submit questions. You can text them, write them, email them. I have a couple on file that are a little bit lengthier to address, and so there will be sermons on those, but that will take a little more time and a little more research. So tonight, let's begin with question 1. This came out of Bible class on Wednesday nights a number of months ago in 2 Kings chapter 12. 2 Kings chapter 12 in verse 16. It says, "What is the difference between the guilt offering and the sin offering? With money being involved, are they paying for forgiveness?" So let's just read this and put it in front of us for just a little bit. This is under Joash's restoration of the temple. And so in verse 15 to begin, it says, "And they did not ask for an accounting from the men into whose hand they delivered the money to pay out to the workmen, for they dealt honestly. The money from the guilt offerings and the money from the sin offerings was not brought into the house of the Lord. It belonged to the priests." Okay? So there you see the guilt offering and the sin offering. So that's kind of the first side of the question, and then we'll pay attention to the second side. Are they paying for forgiveness? Well, to understand these offerings, we have to go to the beginnings of, I know is your favorite book of the Bible, it's Leviticus. And it really is a good book if people will give it a chance. It really is filled with a lot of important things. So the sin offering, as we know it, as it is mentioned there, is expounded for us in Leviticus 4:1 through 5:13. Okay? So you have the sin offering. Now here's the thing about the sin offering, beginning in 4. So even though these chapters may be somewhat long, really they're easy to break down because what he's doing is giving multiple scenarios of what can happen. So for an example, in chapter 4 and verse number 3, it says, if it is an anointed priest who sins, and then he gives the instructions for him. In verse 13, if the whole congregation of Israel sins, and then you have an list of instructions. In verse 22, when a leader sins. In verse 27, if any one of the common people sins. And so understanding that is going to help us see the structure of what is going on. Now the sin offering and the guilt offering are similar, but they're very different from the first 3 offerings that are mentioned in chapters 1, 2, and 3. Okay? The first 3 offerings were voluntary offerings. Okay? Things that you offered of your own volition. Okay? Sin was not involved. One of the things that changes in 5 and 6, where we run in, or 4, 5, and 6, where we run into the guilt offering and the sin offering, is one of the reasons there's money involved is because it has to do with restitution. Okay? The sin offering and the guilt offering are connected because they're dealing with things along those lines. So, as one writer put it, and I'll just read this statement to you I found to be helpful. He says, the difference may be due to the fact that the sin and guilt offering are to be made as a consequence to a certain offense, while the offerings of Leviticus 1 through 3 could be viewed as voluntary. Whereas the main issue in the burnt and grain and fellowship offerings was the proper procedure to be followed, the main issue in the discussion of the sin and guilt offerings is the occasion which would require the sacrifices. Then he continues further. Beginning in Leviticus 4, the author deals with mandatory offerings required because of the committing of sin. Sin constitutes a violation of the covenant by a member of the Israelite covenant community. In the Old Testament, there were 2 categories of sins. One, sins that were committed with a high hand, and sins that were committed inadvertently. And a high hand is phrases used from Numbers. Sins committed with a high hand are not forgiven. That is, they are continuously rebellious against God, while sins committed inadvertently may be forgiven and atoned for through the sacrificial procedure. Sins committed with the high hand are discussed in Numbers 15, okay, and are comparable to the New Testament concepts of sins against the Holy Spirit. And so we have these sin offering and the guilt offering. So in chapter 4 and verse 1 it says, "The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the people of Israel, saying, If anyone sins unintentionally in any of the Lord's commandments about things not to be done, and does any one of them." Okay? Unintentionally. Not going out there. A high-handed sin is going out there and knowing what God has said and rebelling against him and say, I don't care, I don't want anything to do with him, I don't honor him, I don't respect him, and plunging right ahead. That's a high-handed sin, okay? Others committed through weakness or through ignorance, those are things that deal with the sin offering. Now, it gets a little bit more detailed with the guilt offering, okay? So with the guilt offering, there is the principle of restitution. So chapter 5 and verse 14 to begin. It says, "The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, If anyone commits a breach of faith and sins unintentionally in any of the holy things of the Lord, he shall bring to the Lord as his compensation a ram without blemish out of the flock, valued in the silver shekels, according to the shekel of the sanctuary for a guilt offering. He shall also make restitution for what he has done and amiss in the holy things, and a fifth of it shall be given to the priest, and the priest shall make an atonement." And so sinning with the holy things could be with vessels that were in the temple area or the tabernacle area in particular here. And so the reason he's having to pay restitution is because the individual has corrupted those instruments and they have to be replaced. And you don't replace them for free, right? So you have to restore. That individual has to offer money to make restitution for what it is that they have ruined. Okay, that's the whole point of restitution. The same way, if we're involved with something and we damage it, we have to pay restitution for it. So, if you continue down to chapter 6 and verse 7, we're not going to read all through that. That's the idea behind the guilt offering and the sin offering. Okay? So the sin offering is more broad. The guilt offering is incurring because there are multiple situations. The holy things is in the first part of chapter 5 and verse 14. Doing things, any of the Lord's commands which ought not to be done in chapter 5 and verse 17. Commits a breach of faith against the Lord by deceiving a neighbor in a matter of deposit or security through robbery. That's a guilt offering. You have to pay restitution. You stole money, you have to return it, and usually with interest. Okay? So there's the slight difference. Okay? One of them involves financial restitution because you're either robbing or destroying something, and that has to be replaced. Okay? So that then leads to the second part of the question, are they paying for forgiveness? The answer is no. They're not earning forgiveness by paying restitution on something that they have destroyed, any more than you and I would earn forgiveness if we went out, if I took Dwayne Key's car and just smashed it into something, rolled it into a building. I'm going to be accountable for what happens. I'm going to be accountable to pay restitution to what has happened. That doesn't mean I earned forgiveness in any way. It's just restoring and making right what I have destroyed. And so it's a subtle difference, but it's one that is important and needs to be understood. In Numbers chapter 5, verses 5 through 10 says that the money, there is a percentage to be paid, and that percentage goes to the priesthood. Okay? And that's what's happening in 2 Kings chapter 12. All right? Number 2. Can we extend our lives, or are they fixed? Matthew 6 and verse 27, Sermon on the Mount. You remember, this isn't a discussion about being anxious. He says, "And which of you by being anxious can add a single hour to his span of life?" That's the way the ESV renders it. Other translations are going to render it a little bit differently, and that has to do with manuscripts that they used to translate from. So the question is, can we add to our lives or are they already fixed? So you could look at things like, if my time is already fixed, is taking medicine really necessary? Is eating healthy and exercising really necessary because that time span is fixed? And there's nothing I could really do to change that time span. And I would say the answer to it is going to depend upon the way you approach certain subjects. Now, within the context, that's where I want to deal with it first. Within the context, the point of the context that Jesus is making is to stop worrying about things, because worry definitely cannot lengthen your life. Okay? Worrying doesn't have, matter of fact, what we know now is what? It can actually have the opposite effect. We can literally worry ourselves to death and impede the status of our life. And so that idea almost has the answer built into it, right? If I can worry myself to death, drive myself to that point, then something in my action affects, in some way, the length of my life. So, and furthermore, what he's doing in the context, he's using this question rhetorically to make a point, right? He's not necessarily making a doctrinal statement about whether our lives are fixed or not. So, with that being said, that goes to an important question that deals with the knowledge of God. And that's a highly debated subject matter, to say the least. Are our days fixed? Well, so some people look at Hebrews 9:27, and it says it's appointed to man once to die, and after this the judgment. Well, yes, man is appointed to die, but in that context I don't see anything about our lifespans being fixed. Okay? But there is a text that is alluded to by a number of people in Job chapter 14 and verse 5. Job chapter 14 and verse 5 says this: "Since his days are determined and the number of his months is with you, you have appointed him limits that he cannot pass." This is Job in the midst of his suffering talking about life and how man is few days and full of trouble. And then he says, his days are determined and the number of his months are with you. You've appointed the limits that he cannot pass. So some people look at this and say, well, God has already determined exactly how many days and hours and seconds and nanoseconds you're going to live. The first thing I would say, just in consideration, is remember that Job 14:5 is written in poetry. Okay? What difference does that make? What is one of the things that is very different about poetry than everyday language? You have elaboration, right? We call it poetic license. You communicate things. You use hyperboles. You use strong images to illustrate a point you're trying to make. And so if you take poetic literature and you force it into literal understanding, we kind of set ourselves up for the misuse of the type of literature we're dealing with to begin with. Okay? When I look at that, I don't see that as saying he's got us narrowed down to the very nanoseconds. I think he's just talking about the control of God and that humanity can't escape that control. I don't necessarily see it as some kind of a doctrinal discussion of the very nature of God's foreknowledge and whether our lives will be lived a certain way. The old statement is, if it's our time to go, it's our time to go. Well, you kind of have to be careful with a statement like that, right? I could see an oncoming train and say, well, if it's my time to go, it's my time to go, and I step right in front of it. Come on. That's problematic. You can see that, surely. So we have to be cautious there. Exercise, diet, medicine, all those things. For me, it's kind of hard to argue that the quality and the age of life, even in the culture in which the Bible was written, was significantly less than we have now, right? You're looking 40s, 50s most of the time. I mean, that's why the Psalms say 60 or 70, maybe 80. I mean, that's the high limits, especially in a culture where you didn't have modern medical advancement. So all of that hodgepodge of ideas, that's something that all of those need to be taken into consideration when we're considering something like this. But as far as within the context of Matthew 6 and verse 27, I think the point he's making more of is trust God. Okay? Because worrying is not going to get you anywhere, right? Worrying is kind of like walking on a treadmill when you want to go to Arizona. I mean, you can say you did a lot of walking, but you didn't move. You didn't get to where you were going. And so I think that's more of the idea behind what Jesus is communicating. All right, number 3. This is a question that I've had for a long time, and one of the things I like and also maybe sometimes don't like about Q&A is it forces my hand on things that I've wondered about and I still haven't nailed down, and now I've got to, because I got to get some kind of an answer to it. So it says in the Bible, David is called a man after God's own heart, and Abraham, the friend of God. However, David committed adultery. Both of them were married to multiple women. How do we understand this in the light of Jesus' clear teaching on marriage? Dwayne, you want to take this one? Yeah. So, David is called a man after God's own heart. 1 Samuel 13 and verse 14, Acts 13 and verse 22. Abraham's called the friend of God in 2 Chronicles 20 and verse 7, Isaiah 41, 8, and James 2:23. Obviously, David committed adultery. 2 Samuel chapter 11, murder also involved in there. Both of them had multiple wives. David was married first to a daughter of Saul, and then he married Abigail, and then he married several other women you can read about in 2 Samuel 5. He's having a multiplicity of children. Obviously, Abraham marries, he's married to Sarah, and Hagar gets involved. And people say, well, she was a concubine. Well, that just shows you how convoluted we're getting. A concubine is kind of like it feels dirty to even say it, but a second-rate wife. It still has the regulations that marriage have, okay? So however you want to cut it, he's married to multiple women. Okay, you can make the distinction all you want to. He's married to multiple women. And then how does it deal with Jesus' clear teaching on marriage in Matthew 19? You remember Jesus is asked about, is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause? And what Jesus does, you see, what they're really expecting him to do is to give an answer to Deuteronomy 24. So there were two schools of thought at the time. Two famous rabbis that had probably died right before Jesus was born. You had Hillel and Shammai, and they interpreted in Deuteronomy 24, if a husband finds an uncleanness in his wife. And the discussion centered around what was the idea of uncleanness. One rabbi said the uncleanness is clearly adultery, and that's the only thing it can mean. Another rabbi said, and when people say it, I used to think some people were exaggerating, but it's literally there in rabbinic doctrine or documents. If she burns a meal, you can find justification for divorce. So you have two opposite ends of the spectrum there. What they're really doing, though, they're not interested in the answer to the question. Okay. Either way Jesus answers in their mind, he's going to be in trouble with one school. Okay? And Jesus takes the position, obviously, that says, no, the only uncleanness is fornication. That's the only thing that's there. But what's interesting is Jesus does not talk about Deuteronomy 24. He actually cites two texts from Genesis. That's the part they didn't see coming. Is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause? He said, have you not read that he who made them in the beginning made them male and female? That's Genesis 1, 26 and 27. And said, for this cause shall a man leave his father and mother and should be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. That's Genesis 2:24 at the first marriage scene. So he takes those two texts and he puts them together and says, no, this was God's original design and intention. Okay? Moses permitted divorce. Divorce is even permitted under the new covenant, but only at the highest level of violation. So, from that, we have often, rightly so, I think, said that marriage is defined as a male and a female being together for life. That's the intention behind it. Obviously, we know death can break that, Romans 7. We know that fornication can break it, Matthew 19:9. So how do you square the ideal that Jesus puts forward with two men who are held up, really the two most famous and faithful men in the Old Testament, Abraham and David? How do those two things mix? Well, I think one thing that we should keep in mind, and by the way, that's not, in what I'm going to say, I'm never going to endorse committing adultery that David did, and I'm never going to endorse marrying multiple wives that either of them did. Okay? So understand my answer is not an endorsement of those two things at all. With that being said, these statements that are made about them are made about the totality of their lives, not just about the sins they committed along the way, the blunders they committed along the way. And for me, to a degree, I find a great deal of comfort in that. That you can have a person who makes monumental mistakes, but yet they can still be considered faithful because of their responses, their penitence, their overall disposition of reverence and faith toward God. And that's how they're characterized. Now the question then comes by some, well, what does that then mean for today when we have the issue of unscriptural marriages? What does this have to say about that? Well, one of the things we've got to remember is that what Jesus has taught is very clear. Okay? Jesus has taught, he's been crystal clear. 3 groups of people can marry, and both of those people have to fall into one of those 3 groups. You've got people who've never been married, 1 Corinthians 7. You've got people whose spouse has died, Romans 7. And you've got people who are the innocent party in a divorce, fornication being committed, Matthew 19:9. Okay? Those 3 things are very clear. And God intends, though, that a man and a woman be married for the rest of their lives. Just because I may not understand everything of God's dealing with these 2 men in the Old Testament, that should not take my eye off the ball of what is crystal clear in the New. Okay? So, may not be the answer you wanted, but that's about all I got. And from what I've read and researched and talked to other people, it's kind of with a lot of these questions, I wish there were a clear answer to them. There's just not. There's a lot of different ideas that we have to try and consider and reach a conclusion of what is going on. So if again, just kind of summarize, if I had to boil it down, I would say he's talking about the totality of their lives, the same way that you and I make mistakes all the time, big or small. but yet the totality of our lives can be considered faithful. And as far as the implications for God allowed that, so saying that he would allow this under the New Testament, that's not solid thinking, in my opinion. Jesus has been pretty clear. Matter of fact, I think he's been crystal clear. So if I'm trying to use that as a justification to do something in the new, that's not good reasoning. Okay. So those are the three questions that we have. Somebody please give me easier ones next time. And so as we always do with these, I want to close with letting God ask us a question. In Matthew 16, after Jesus promises to build the church, and then you remember Peter makes the great confession, and then Jesus begins to tell them that he's going to go to Jerusalem and suffer many things of the elders, chief priests, and scribes and be killed. And Peter takes him aside and begins to rebuke him. Pretty bold move. And then Jesus responds in 16:24. And Jesus told his disciples, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will find it." And so Jesus actually stands by the answer he gave, that he's going to die, and says, you know what? And if you want to follow me, you're going to have to die too. You're going to have to take up your cross. The cross is an instrument of death. And we have to die to ourselves. I mean, that's Christianity. You put your desires to death, the selfish desires. And that's, I think that's what Paul meant in 1 Corinthians 15 when he said, I die daily. Every day I get up, I've got a choice about who I'm going to serve, whose desires I'm going to carry out, mine or God's. And so Jesus is saying you're going to have to do that. You're going to have to put your self and your will to death. And then he says, you know, you can almost see him anticipating the question. People say, well, that's kind of a lot. Yeah, but then he asks that old question, but what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? And then he says, and what will a man give in exchange for his soul? So the first side of that question kind of shows you that our soul, who we are, it's the most valuable thing we possess. So what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his soul? So apparently everything in the world, all of its riches, all of its wealth can't be compared to that. And then he asks this question, and what will a man give in exchange for it? That's kind of an open-ended searching question, right? What is your soul worth? It's kind of like the old skeptic or really successful businessman who says everybody's got a price. Well, a lot of people do have a price, but not everybody. Is my soul really worth doing what I want to do for a few years? Is losing my soul really worth being able to just, tell people what I'm thinking and not have to care about the way I treat other people? Is my soul really worth arguing with God when he has been clear on something and saying, yeah, but I don't think so? I mean, when I look at it that way, I think of one of my best friend Robert. He was putting his daughter Anna to sleep one night, and he had been in there with her to try and help her wind down and whatever, and he told her it was time to go to bed, and she, like any kid, she's a tremendous kid, genius kid. She just said no. He said, I just laughed and said, I am 36 years old. You are 4. What do you think you're going to do? Who do you think is going to win this? That's the equivalent of us looking at God and saying, no. How do you think that's going to turn out? A lot worse than just having to go to sleep. So that's what we have to consider for ourselves. What are we willing to give in exchange for our souls? God was willing to give himself. He was willing to leave heaven and come to earth and give himself so that our souls could be saved. That's the highest price that could ever be paid. So are we willing to sell it for something far less? Maybe so. So if tonight, if we're struggling with sin, we're exchanging our soul for something far inferior, maybe just saying, I've got to be right, I've got to win an argument, I've got to, whatever it may be, it's not worth it. Jesus is very clear. Penitent faith in him, confessing him to be immersed in water for the forgiveness of our sins, or maybe as a New Testament Christian, not living with those priorities of living out the will of God every day. Or maybe we're just struggling with something else. Whatever it may be, if this is an opportunity for us to pray about it together, and we'd be happy to as we stand and sing this song.